To your first question, like how does parity with China impact the conflict in Russia and Ukraine? The conflict itself is secondary.
Well, it was actually the other way. How does the conflict in Ukraine delay, enhance, accelerate, maybe put off the possibility of parity? Never mind China taking over, but how does that conflict impact parity?
So what's happening is China gets a chance to use the Ukraine conflict as a test ground, as a learning ground for what they can do and can't do in Taiwan and throughout the South China Seas, because they want to exercise their rights in the South China Sea, and they have a marginally more difficult time because Taiwan is 80 miles away off of a coast, whereas Ukraine was just across the border, right, across a forest essentially from Russia. So they're watching to see how the world reacts to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is a truly sovereign state. Taiwan is not a sovereign state, right? Even according to American doctrine, Taiwan already belongs to China, right? It's just they call it one country, two systems, but they still treat it as one country. So it's a really sticky situation. But China's watching to see what Russia does in Ukraine, and more specifically, China's watching to see how long does Western support for Ukraine last? Because think about this for a second. Put yourself in Xi Jinping's shoes. Where has Western money gone for the last 2 years?
I don't know. Into NATO?
Into NATO.
Sure.
Right? So what happens if the day after the peace is negotiated in Ukraine, China invades Taiwan? How much money even exists?
Good point.
To fund a conflict in Taiwan?
Yeah.
Basically none.
Like it's almost like a rope-a-dope.
Right. So that's exactly, and that's what the United States is calling, that's the strategy the United States is using in Ukraine as well. As long as Ukraine is a burr in Russia's saddle, Russia's spending money, spending ammunition, spending troops, spending effort and time and focus on this conflict in Ukraine, which means America doesn't have to fight Russia for Russia to degrade in power and capability, and the United States just gets to stay equal. China's doing the same fucking thing.
True.
China's sitting here saying the only threat to our ability to take over Taiwan is NATO in the West. Well, NATO and the West are getting drained of resources, drained of patience, drained of everything right there in Ukraine.
Public opinion right now has shifted dramatically, especially after the Maui fires, right? Like, you're only paying X to each family, and meanwhile, Ukraine is being funded with hundreds of millions. So
this is the game. This is the geopolitical game. This is the truth of the game that even when I was in that August interview that you're referencing, I was saying this is how it's going to work, right? China's going to sit there and watch. Russia's going to sit there and watch. They know that if they just park landmines and tanks, just wait until Ukraine is no longer the most interesting subject to the West. And once Ukraine's not the popular girl in school anymore, then they'll go in and steal the prom date.
Does all of this, China achieving parity or taking over by 2033, 2035 economically, does it not all boil down to the yuan becoming the world reserve currency?
I don't think it all boils down to that.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think it all boils down to that, because there's lots of hurdles in having the renminbi or the yuan become the world currency. And I think one of the biggest hurdles there is that banks aren't going to want to partner with a currency that's not tied to anything and controlled by a party.
Again, right?
Again.
Yeah.
We've done that with the dollar.
Correct.
Hasn't really worked out for the best.
Yeah.
Which is why you see the BRICS trading bloc working towards creating their own currency that is pegged to gold.
Yeah, but isn't that to me feels like a failed strategy. Maybe initially it works, but over time, currency is going to outpace the production of currency is going to outpace the ability to produce gold to back it, is it not?
That's us going back to an American mindset.
How so?
Because that's what the United States does.
Oh.
When you unpeg something, that gives you a chance to print more currency, right? And a part of the reason that we do that is because we're also based on a debt structure. So we actually believe that somehow, this is crazy to me, but the United States is the only economy in the world that created this concept of debt being more valuable than cash. So now we're all encouraged to have debt, right? We have a credit rating based on our ability to manage debt, whereas every place else in the world is basically like you have money or you don't have money. There's no line of credit that the average person has outside of the United States anywhere.
Right.
Like a credit card is a very novel idea outside of the United States. So the world writ large takes comfort in the idea of having real reserves, real value to back whatever currency you have. So instead of controlling the value of currency by printing more or by buying it back and putting it in reserves to control the value of the currency itself, you actually have currency that is tied to a specific asset or resource.
Interesting. Population decline millennial population in the United States being a very large population, immigration into the United States still in the million plus per year legally, along with, I don't know, deglobalization, I guess is the best way to put it. I mean, when you look at the NAFTA countries, we are a net exporter of everything, potash, fuel, food, right? We can self-sustain between Canada, US, and Mexico. That's one of the things to me that makes me wonder about the Ray Dalio sort of projection of, yeah, hey, look, this is the arc, and by this time China takes over because of just historic sort of precedent. China is facing a population cliff, a population decline in the next, say, 80 to 100 years. Russia is on its last leg in terms of population as well. Does that factor in at any point in the short-term calculus of whether or not China can take over as a world power? Deglobalization and depopulation, if you will, of the Chinese people.
Here's the truth of it, and I'm really glad you brought this up because there's so many people talking about this that don't know what the fuck they're talking about. Okay?
Got it.
Because here's what's happening. Let's start with deglobalization. Deglobalization is not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. It will be a temporary blip because guess what human beings are? We have a short memory. So COVID came through. We all found all of our supply lines went through China. Why were all of our supply lines going through China in the first place?
Yeah.
Expense. Guess what's going to last longer than our memory?
Yeah.
Expense. The supply lines are just going to either continue to go through China or more likely they're going to find some other third world country to go through. But globalization is not dying. Globalization is going to evolve and it's going to change slightly. But everybody from your bakery in Wisconsin to your multi-billion-dollar firm in New York City, we're all going to recognize in 10, 12, 15 years. It just doesn't make sense to have diversified supply chains if it costs us an extra 15% on the bottom line because we have shareholders and stockbrokers that we need to keep happy, right? And the only way that that's going to happen is if we can recapture 7% of that 15% and squeeze a little bit more out of our supply line. So now instead of diversifying through 4 different channels, we're going to diversify only through 2 different channels. But we're still going to diversify because globalization is very much going to happen. So the idea of deglobalization, hard stop, never going to happen. It'll change, it'll evolve, it'll flux. The only time we ever really had the idea of an isolationist policy was going up into World War II. And how did that turn out, right? It turned out like shit. We're never going to go back to that. So, and the United States knows that if we want to have economic dominance, we need globalization because globalization is the tool that we use to leverage influence over other countries. If we can't promise them some bit of trade with the United States, they're not going to partner with us. They're going to partner with somebody else who does promise them trade. So deglobalization is a myth. People can talk about it all they want. It makes great clickbait on YouTube. It makes a fantastic little reel that you can watch on Instagram, but it's bullshit. It doesn't make any economic sense. It doesn't make any geopolitical sense. It doesn't make any long-term national security defense sense. So people are out of their mind. Now let's talk about population decline. When you look at population decline in the United States, how does the average American feel about population decline here in the U.S.?
Feel about it? I feel like it's an external problem, not an internal problem. That's how most feel like.
So then how do you think the average Chinese person feels about it too?
Fair.
Now let's bump it up. Who votes in the United States?
What do you mean by who votes?
Who makes the majority of the voting base?
White men?
Old people.
Yeah.
People over the age of 55. Actually, people over the age of 45.
True.
Because we care enough to vote, because we're invested in our country. Who votes in China?
Everyone.
Nobody.
Oh, true. That's true. Yeah. A totalitarian state. Yeah.
So guess how much they care about their voting base? They don't care about a voting base.
That's fair.
Okay? So in the United States, you have old people in office who want to protect and make an older population feel very comforted and feel very safe, which is why you have constant debates about healthcare and retirement and, you know, the list goes on, Medicaid and Medicare, because the people that the politicians want to make the most happy are the aging demographic who becomes the voter that votes the next president, the next congressman, the next senator. So we have a country that's very focused on an aging population to keep them happy, to keep the power base in control. That's just the way it is. We don't care about the 21-year-old because guess what the national income is of the average 21-year-old? It's like $35,000. The average income of a 55-year-old is like $65,000. So which one's creating more GDP for the country? The older person. So who do we focus on? The older person. In China, it's the exact opposite. In China, the older you are, the less you contribute to the country. And remember how I said earlier on, you can't look at, if you think that China operates like the United States, that's mistake number one.
Yeah.
China has zero problem letting 50% of their population die. They have no problem with that because the 50% that's going to die is the least contributory to GDP. They're the least beneficial to national production. And if anything, they're the ones that are preventing the younger generation from being able to step up into higher positions. So you see China taking a very aggressive shift towards going from being a manufacturing country only to now becoming a tech manufacturing country. They still want to manufacture. They still want to pollute the environment. They still want to put people to work. They still want to run slave labor mills. They just want to do it creating their own version of high tech, semiconductors, memory chips, silicon wafers, et cetera, et cetera. They want to have control of a tech industry that they also create all the manufacturing for. Who do they need to do that? Young bodies. They have all the young bodies they need. They just also have an excess of old bodies that can't do those jobs. So in the United States, in 2023, we would never imagine a president just letting conditions exist where 25% of people just die. But in communist China, that is exactly the kind of condition that Xi Jinping would allow to have happen.
That is terrifying.
Why? Why? What are you going to care if 250 million Chinese people died tomorrow?
Yeah.
Would that really affect us?
Well, my point is it's terrifying in as much that you said it. The American perspective is what I was actually going to ask the question, where is my bias here? And you've already pointed it out. The American perspective is they're going to lose half their population. There's no way they can become a world power. But the way you just framed it up makes a ton of sense. You're right. They don't care. It doesn't matter. So their path to dominance becomes that much easier. So that actually creates another question for me.
Think about it. They know that you can't be a world power. You can't be the superpower of the world if you carry more than 1 billion people in population. Right? That's why nobody's worried about India becoming a superpower. Right? They carry 1.6 billion people. How many people are in the United States? 350 million. That's a third of what they have in China.
Yeah.
They have no problem losing huge population swells.
That's a great point.
They've done it before. They did it during Mao Zedong's age.
There's your climate control. There's you're cleaning up the climate too.
Yep.
So, with that in mind, then, so we talked about entrepreneurship. I love your point on that. You mentioned about investing in assets, and a lot of people listening to this show are going to be those that invest in real estate specifically, me included. I invest in a lot of stuff in Denver. So if we are to be at parity or maybe secondary in 10 years, you got a bug out bag taking you to the EU. Maybe I'm back in the DR at that point with my passport. Is it a smart play then to be investing in hard assets here in the United States?
As long as you can get your capital out of those assets, yes. Because guess what? All of our adversaries, guess where they're also investing?
Here.
Hard assets in the United States. The Cubans are buying property in Miami.
Yep.
The Chinese are buying property in Chicago. The Russians are buying property in Jersey Shore. They're buying money. They're putting their money into our economy because up until early 2023, the United States was a free and open market until we decided to sanction Russian money. And now people don't trust the American banking system anymore.
Yep.
Either way, at least as Americans, we would hope that we can trust our banking system, but we have to look past Silicon Valley Bank. But
Fair, yeah, great point.
So we really don't know what to expect. But when it comes to if you want to stash your money and you want to have assets and access to your money, you just always need to have an exit strategy. How much cash do you want to carry? What assets do you want to tie them up in? Are those assets liquidatable in a quick fashion or not? And what's the tier level for how you will bug out? Because one thing that nobody wants to do is, bug out to Australia or New Zealand and then not have a way to collect on the income that they're generating from their commercial real estate in Kansas. That's kind of a nightmare scenario. But if you have a strategy to make it last for 6 or 12 months, which is enough time for you to have someone sell the property that you have in Kansas to turn it into liquid income that you can then transfer to an offshore bank account, it's a different story, right? And we also have to keep in mind that if we're bugging out of the United States, if you're truly going to bug out of the United States for some sort of imminent collapse or some sort of other issue, you're going to have one of two choices. One, the taxation system in the United States will have just totally failed. So you won't have to worry about whether or not you're saving taxes by hiding money at the end of year. It's not going to become an issue anymore. Or you're going to have a superior bank that you can run your bank through. If China actually does become the superpower of the planet, we may just stop banking with, Chase.
Sure.
And you might choose HSBC instead. And they're not going to tax you the way that Chase is going to tax you because they're not an American bank. So you've got to think the whole thing through in terms of like, what are the secondary and tertiary options? What are the next logical sequence of events when you have an actual change of superpower?
The SWIFT bank, the U.S. removing Russia from the SWIFT bank, freezing their assets. It sounds like you're saying gross miscalculation.
Gross miscalculation. Terrible move.
Give me a little bit more.
It was a terrible move because here's what happened, right? The whole world has come to rely on the fact that by having their money in Western banking systems, it's more secure. That's what the whole world thinks. So, and that's what the United States wants the whole world to think, because then they always have a surplus of money in American banking systems. Well, when they sanctioned Russia and they froze Russian assets, and then they also put pressure on European banks to freeze Russian assets, this was good money. This wasn't debt. This was hard currency that the Russians had put into foreign banks in good faith that when they want their money, they can have their money. Well, now you have all these other banks freezing and holding on to that money. One of the first things that happened within 30 days of the United States freezing Russian funds, do you know what China did? Pulled all their money out.
I would imagine.
Pulled all their money out of Western banks, all their money out of European banks. And then you saw that behavior continue through all of your other developing countries, right? Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Oman, Vietnam. Yeah, they're like, we can't trust our money here. Because now if we piss off the Americans, they're going to hold our money, which goes against the promise that they gave us in the contract. So now all that outflow of capital goes somewhere else. Nobody knows where it's going to go, which is why you also saw at the same time an alternative to the SWIFT be proposed by both India and China. India already had an alternative. China was developing an alternative, but you saw them both expedite their processing systems to compete with what was going on in the United States.
Was this a politically expedient, politically pressured move, or is there potentially a longer game to it?
Politically, it was a dumb shit move by the Biden administration. So for the whole problem with Ukraine is that it came on the heels of COVID, and people are forgetting this already, right? In January of 2022, all of our woes were tied to a declining economy, inflation, and struggles coming out of a post-COVID policy. And people were already questioning whether or not COVID policies were good policies in the first place. Well, then, here's Russia to the rescue, invading Ukraine. And now we have this external enemy, which is a super important thing in intelligence. You have to have an external enemy to focus everybody on. So the Biden administration, very intelligently, was like, here's our new enemy. It's not COVID, it's Russia. The same old enemy that we've always hated. And now they're attacking democracy in Ukraine. Hint, hint, Ukraine was never a democracy.
Right. Yeah.
Right? So all of a sudden they can focus and rally all this attention on what's going on in Ukraine. And of course, the press, looking for just anything to talk about that people are going to read and click on, talks about the same thing. So now the whole focus of the American population is focused on Ukraine. Most of the world actually doesn't really care about what's going on in Ukraine because they're just trying to make ends meet day to day. But the American population and most of the West can focus on this Ukraine topic as a priority issue now. And that saves us from answering all those hard questions we had coming out of the COVID years about whatever else. Does that mean there's some kind of conspiracy? There was no conspiracy. Russia did what Russia did. Biden did what Biden did. But there's a reason that there's a public relations office at the White House.
That's true.
Because they need to create narratives. They need to see opportunities like this to say, hey, guys, we're losing in this category of American opinion. But if we focus all of our attention on this other category, then in 6 months or so, people are going to completely forget this other thing even happened, right? Remember what happened in Hong Kong in 2019?
No.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. Right? Because when China violently took over Hong Kong in 2019, it was right before COVID. So Xi Jinping got the benefit of, he just took hostile control over a Western powered economy.
Yep.
Everybody was up in arms until COVID broke out. And then people completely forgot about Hong Kong. And then people only cared about COVID for like a year and a half until people were upset with how we handled COVID. And then Ukraine happened. And now everybody forgot about Hong Kong and everybody forgot about COVID.
Yeah. Unless they come back with mask mandates soon. Boy, they better not. They better not.
So fresh on me. Freedom!